Welcome to this session of the Battle for Europe. We're going to be discussing Europe's new far rights, fear or fantasy.
One of the things, that is not happening right now in Europe is that the far right is suddenly sort of on the hinges of taking power across Europe broadly, nor is it about to launch the next wave of terrorist violence. The old far right's ideas of racism, biological racism, anti-Semitism, support for these ideas has fallen as one generation has replaced the next. That this is primarily something that is driven by economic grievances and economic inequality. That's the problem, because that is not consistent with the evidence base on far-right support in Europe. These parties collectively have been polling support from the early 1980s onwards in some of the most affluent regions of Europe during periods of economic stability and economic growth. The number one most important driver of support for the far right, in my view, it's around the notion of cultural threat and anxieties that certain values and ways of life are under threat from immigration and rising diversity.
I don't think it's ever been more easy for small groups to very quickly mobilise online and offline to protest, to cause great disruption to people, and to actually continue to get more and more media coverage and create this sense of crisis that potentially isn't anywhere near as serious as we might think it is.
Who has done more to discredit democracy across Europe than the political elites? The EU is an exercise in saying that democracy essentially can be dangerous because people's popular passions become aroused, and those conflicting popular passions of groups, deep-rooted identities, can simply just destroy society and plunge the whole of Europe into war. And they even have a historical mythology, which is that fascists and Nazis were swept to power on a huge sort of wave of popular sentiment, which defies all historical record. And there's an element in which people like the Front National, Golden Dawn, Jobbik play this incredibly conservative role in almost reassuring the elites that this is what people are like. So there is this rather unhealthy interest in them. Much more dangerous than the far right is this sort of giving up on democracy. On the one hand, this belief is as if you just let go, then a new or the true state of political nature in Europe will emerge, and it's a bunch of Nazis.
Extremism is often associated with people, or Islamophobia, as if it's a medical condition that people suffer from, whereas they only have a particular view about the creed that is called Islam. And so I think this distinction is very important, whether we talk about groups actually resorting to violence, which should be combated, and then those who have views that are different from the orthodoxy, which I think should be welcomed, because democracies and civilizations generally function better if we put more opposing views together and then see if the best comes out.
But what the groups in Europe do share, I think, fundamentally, is a rejection of human equality, the principle of human equality. Now, in the 40s and the 50s, that was about biology, race and ancestry. Those arguments now are just simply not socially acceptable. Only about 15% or so of the British population would back the idea that you have to be white to be British. But what are not on the way out comes back to this notion of threatened cultures.
I think this worry is very real, and the threat of losing our national identities is very real. We suffer from this one-sided approach of when you defend your own culture and your own identity, you're branded as xenophobe. But you might easily juxtapose the argument and say, when you want national cultures to be diluted, then you're a oikophobe. Then you are afraid of your own home and you hate your own home. And this might be actually the pathological condition that our elites are suffering from. And the more you criminalize this view, the more you say, oh, it's xenophobia, it's only a view of those who are ill-educated, the more it will radicalize. So I think that's definitely the better approach.
I'm very pro-immigration, and I'm pro-immigration for moral reasons. But the idea that people who are anti-immigration are beyond the pale, I think, is a hysterical response that actually helps confirm the depth of their victimhood and exclusion. In the 60s, the whole concept of national identity was really challenged by the events of the 60s, the sexual revolution, 1968. The idea of national identity and what was right and what was wrong was already highly contested, and immigration comes into that context rather than immigration driving it. So you have to ask yourself why Dutch people who live in an incredibly affluent and wealthy society that was, completely homogenous after the Second World War, until they asked some people to come in and do the horrible dirty jobs that they didn't want to do anymore. If they'd had such a strong sense of national identity, why are they so hysterical about people putting a cloth over their head? If they had such a strong sense of national identity, they felt their societies really represented them, then why have this strange response to immigration?
The problem is, and it was the same problem when we were talking about Islamic extremism all the time 5 years ago, which was how you make a distinction between action, terrorist action, which we all of course denounce, and whether or not there are a certain set of more generally extreme ideas that, while not illegal in themselves in any way, and we welcome that, might be encouraging either a breakdown of social cohesion or giving the moral oxygen or support for other more radical groups to act.
Well, I completely disagree. Even before Breivik, and I've been studying this, there have been quite a few trials where politicians and intellectuals discussing immigration and questioning the doctrines of Islam have been not only put on trial but actually been condemned by courts for either financial punishment or even not being able to stand for election anymore, as the case in Belgium illustrates. So even before Breivik, we've had this criminalization of this body of thought, which is unnecessary because you can simply draw the line at inciting to violence.
The leaders of these parties have been able to talk about these subjects, and it's interesting the way now, especially when they're talking about it a lot more now, they're still playing the game of no one lets us speak.
Because people are so intolerant of certain sets of ideas, particularly sets of ideas that are seen to be discriminatory or are seen to go against the principles of human equality, it tends to take on a friend-enemy sort of characteristic, where people who are with you are your friends and those who aren't with you really are your enemies, and they can be criminalised. Race hatred legislation, certainly in the UK, has moved way beyond incitement here, and I think that's a real problem, to create that friend-enemy relationship militarises it, and I think that's a really big problem.
The real worry for me is the people like Anders Breivik, and they're the people that drop out entirely of being involved in political activism. I mean, that's what worries me more than actually people that are involved in perhaps groups that I don't like, right-wing populist groups that I disagree with, but when they're part of the party, I think it's a much better situation than when they remove themselves entirely.
Who also seem to conflate, and I resist that, far-right thinking with, it's just one step away from using violence, and I think this is completely. I don't think I did
say that at all. Actually, what I said is that people that are part of these parties and movements aren't a concern to me. It's the individuals that completely end up rejecting all form of political activism whatsoever, remove themselves from society, and then start plotting actually to act.
There is a unique aspect to these organisations in the sense that many of them, not all, many of them specifically cultivate narratives among their followers that would justify violence under certain conditions, which is why I kind of resist this notion that people like Breivik are simply deranged and pathological. Actually, the Norwegians were very careful to keep Breivik within the wider political context from where he emerged, which was the right thing to do, because he reflected a set of narratives that are very much cultivated within the far right, and they're not cultivated in mainstream politics.
But those narratives exist in all kinds of little sort of lacunae of sort of politics. I do think there is a problem with the breakdown of shared narratives, the breakdown of the idea of universalism that can give rise to intensely isolated individuals who feel very cut off and victimised, who can sit at home surfing the internet. But I really don't think it's extremist ideas that give rise to people like Breivik.
Of course there are narratives that promote violence across different political movements, across the political spectrum. What I'm trying to kick back at is this idea that anybody on the far right who engages in violence is somehow pathological, is psychologically disturbed, has a particular personality that nobody else sort of has. And this was popular in like 1945 when Adorno and others were looking at the Nazis, but it's since been completely discredited in terms of the research base, and it is a really unhelpful distraction because it takes us away from looking at the dynamics between supporters and movements and the way in which movements on the right, like those on the left, cultivate among their followers particular ideas and narratives. Breivik in many ways was significant, not because he was a loon, but because he essentially did what AQ or Al-Qaeda did to disgruntled Muslims. He offered a brand.
I said he was deranged. I didn't say there was a pathology involved.
But that implies that it's his mental state and it had nothing to do with the surrounding context in which he was embedded.
I said deranged because it was an individual action that is beyond the pale of normal behaviour, even on the far right.
Right.
Yeah. But so I said the word deranged was used. If I'd said he was mentally ill, I would have said he was mentally ill. Individuals who are extremely isolated, who are becoming deranged in the sense they're losing all kinds of proportion in terms of expressing their grievance or accounting for their lives, do often turn to extremist ideas. If you look at other Breiviks, they often have taken up extremist ideas. I read the dreadful document because we were looking for all the different links, assuming that there might be a network. He entirely made it up. He could have made up anything. It could have been Knights Templar. It could have been Hogwarts. It could have been absolutely anything. There is a problem with a political view which is called realism, a thinker called Carl Schmitt, who argued that in all politics war is imminent. So all politics, if really lets rip, if its contradictions really emerge, will lead to violence. He was a Nazi official. His work was then taken up by people in, say, Red Army faction. It's been taken up by a group of international relations theorists as well, because they genuinely believe that intrinsic to human relationships is violence. That one day human relationships, when pushed to extremists, will end up in violence. And that means you can either justify violence or you can justify all kinds of counter measures to democracy, and because democracy is seen as a source of conflict, to prevent the imminency of violence. And what I worry about with this discussion is you're saying that a certain corpus of thought, which I think is pretty absurd, far-right conspiracy theory thought, somehow contains within it this germ of imminent violence, even if it is deranged individuals like Breivik, rather than sort of Golden Dawn squads. And I find that worrying because it's a pre-justification for something else.
All the millions of people who backed the NSDAP in the 30s were isolated and there was something kind of wrong with them.
They weren't Breiviks.
But they were still flocking to an extremist ideology, somebody who was quite open about persecuting a minority community. So therefore there's something fundamentally wrong here.
They're not Breiviks. I said that somebody who's on the verge of committing a deranged act will often lean to absurd conspiracy theories. That's what I said. It's completely different from the rise of a mass party.
But my point to come back to that is, Breivik wasn't isolated and out in the fringes going through some psychological problem. He was an active member of the far-right blogosphere for several years. He passed through far-right organisations.
I'm worried about groups which seek to undermine the democratic rights of other citizens, whether or not it leads to violence or not, because I think that is a problem. Doesn't mean I want to ban it, doesn't mean I think that we should be going completely crazy and justifying all kind of counter-democratic measures to make sure that doesn't become too widespread a phenomenon. But I'm still concerned about it, I'm still interested in it, I want to understand what's driving it and where it might be going.